However, recently I was emailed a really fantastic article written by Steve Schultz. Some of you know him, and he is a teacher in the community and also just an incredible writer. He often wrote for Fountain Valley Living. He also shows up here on occasion and worships with us at King of Glory. He's actually up in the balcony. But just a phenomenal person and such spiritual depth to Steve. And he sent me an article recently that he wrote. And he coined in that article a new term, not the Karen and Ken, but a new term. He said that there is an epidemic right now of Ians. Ians. Has anybody heard that one? Yeah, it's because he made it up. He's so smart. So what an Ian is a Christian who removes Christ from their daily living, from their behavior. So you see how he came up with that, right? Christian, if you remove the C-H-R-I-S-T, the Christ, what are you left with? I-A-N. Yep, Ian. So in Steve's article, he talks about how there's a lot of Ians amongst us. You know, people that remove the words and the ways of Jesus, even though they profess to be Christians. He says an Ian is someone who talks a lot about the love of Jesus, but fails to be the love that Jesus talked about. So you get it? Okay, so that's an Ian. So who can be Ians? Steve's got a great example of it in his article, but really anyone can be an Ian, right? It spans the political spectrum. It is all genders, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses. Anyone can be an Ian. And it's sometimes really easy to fall into that temptation of Ianism. I mean, anytime, where Jesus says, forgive, we're called to forgive 70 times 7. But instead, we decide to hold a grudge. We're being an Ian. Anytime we forget Jesus' words, you who have not sinned, cast the first stone, and instead we choose to judge, we choose to exclude, we're being an Ian. Anytime, rather than clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, right, visiting the sick and imprisoned, or like we heard from Isaiah, loosing the bonds of injustice, letting the oppressed go free, anytime we fail to do those in the name of our own self-interest, our own security, we are being an Ian. Anytime we forget how Jesus said to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, and instead we choose our pride, our prejudice, we choose to label those people as other and outside of God's grace, that's when we are being an Ian. Now, a lot of the criticism that the church gets today is about this, right? Younger generations, older generations, people that grew up in the church but fell away, people that were hurt by the church, people who've never stepped foot into church but maybe knew some Christians and was like, I don't want to be a part of that, is because they have experienced hypocrisy and hurt from people in the church, not living the way that Jesus called us to live. And this isn't just in modern day that the church has been plagued by these criticisms, right, by this weakness. I mean, it's happened since the church existed, right? Even before the church existed, before Christianity. I mean, Jesus came out of the tradition of Judaism, right? And Jesus, throughout the Gospel of Matthew, is constantly railing against the church leaders of his day, right? The leaders in Judaism, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees. Jesus is often criticizing them for the same things that the church is criticized for today, right? John the Baptist calls them, just before John the Baptist baptizes Jesus in Matthew chapter 3, John the Baptist calls out the scribes and Pharisees who are there at the Jordan River, and he says, you brood of vipers, right? Yeah, you brood of vipers. Jesus calls the scribes and Pharisees that criticize him for eating with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, he calls them hypocrites on more than one occasion. And toward the end of the Matthew's gospel, I think it's around chapter 23. I don't know the verse, though. But Jesus, maybe in his most scathing criticism of the Jewish leaders of his day, he calls them whitewashed tombs. Do you remember that one? Meaning they are all shiny and new on the outside, but in the inside, there is death and decay. So you see, this criticism of the church, of God's people, it goes all the way back to Jesus and even further. In our first reading from Isaiah, God's self is calling out God's people, the children of Israel, for not walking the walk. Right? God is saying, this is not the fast I desire from you. You say you want righteousness. You say you want to be delighted in my ways. But are you loosing the bonds of injustice? Are you caring for the widow? No, you are oppressing your workers. You are not getting rid of the yoke. You are not welcoming the orphan. God, in God's self, called God's people to task for doing exactly what we're talking about today, right? For being Ians, back when that didn't exist. But really, that's what God and Jesus were saying. And I think Jesus' words today about being salt and light, it's a warning to us about not falling prey to this temptation. Jesus is saying, don't lose your saltiness, right? This call, this gift you've been given. Do not hide your light under a bushel. Do not lose sight of the light that has been shared with you, that you are called to live into and to live out of, sharing with all the world. That is Jesus's words of warning, words of invitation. I mean, you can see it either way this morning. Now, all of this, kind of as I was contemplating Jesus' words this week, it actually reminded me of something that we were going through in our household personally. Some of you may have saw my Facebook post, but if you didn't, so what happened at our house this week was on Tuesday, we were smelling some gas in our house and like around our house. And so I called the gas company to send some inspectors. They came with their little meter, and it was like off the charts. And they're like, yeah, you got some leaks, girl. You got a lot of leaks. And so they immediately turned our gas off. So we had like no heat, no hot water, no way to like run our stove or, the clothes dryer, all the things that use gas in your house that I never knew used gas. Learned so much this week. But it got me thinking about like how much that is like us, or how much we are like that. In that, we have these homes, these bodies, these temples, and within them are these kind of pipelines, these spiritual pipelines that we have. And sometimes those pipelines, they start to corrode. They start to get rusty. They start to leak. They start to even, be on the verge of collapsing sometimes, as ours were. And they start to leak that nasty, toxic gas, right? And it's not just dangerous. It doesn't just stink. It does stink, but it's not just that. Like, it's dangerous. It's not good for your health. And, if you light something nearby, it can start an explosion or a fire. This is dangerous stuff. And I feel like, sometimes we are like that too. Our pipes start to corrode, and we start to leak toxicity, anger, hate, fear, judgmentalism. It just starts to seep out of us, right? And we don't even realize the damage that we might be doing around us, to others, but also to the church as a whole. When people see that and say, oh, that's a Christian? Well, then I don't want to have anything to do with that, right? It's that damage that we can do without even knowing it. So how do we avoid it? Right? If this has been happening since the beginning, God's people were called God's people, how can we avoid this temptation? How can we fix it? Well, I'm here to tell you this morning, we can't. We can't. But Jesus can. Jesus can. I like to think of Jesus, I think I've preached on this once before, but I like to think of Jesus not just as a carpenter, but as our personal plumber. I think if back in Jesus' day they had plumbing like us, he would have used that metaphor too. But for real, I mean, Jesus is like our personal plumber. He comes in and he repipes our hearts. He gives us a whole new system. A whole new system so that we can, have that spiritual gas pumping through us and doing what it's meant to do, right? Bringing light, bringing heat and warmth, bringing hope and shelter as it was meant to do. Now, yes, there are times when we might try to resort back to the old system, right? Those pipes are still there at our house. They're just there. But we got the new ones in now. But the old ones are there. Sometimes we forget, right? And we try to resort back to the old ways of being. One thing I learned, so fascinating, here in California, did you know in our houses, our gas pipe system, I'm sure Jeannie knows this because she knows everything, but our gas pipe system has an earthquake trigger, a trigger wire. Amazing. Kim knew it. Yes. Amazing. So what happens is, if the pipes start to shake too much, there's this little ball that flows out of a hole, and it trips the wire because it's assuming there's an earthquake, and the whole gas system shuts off. It's just crazy. And I think sometimes in our life, when we go through shaky times for whatever reason, or when we go through, really tumultuous times, sometimes our spiritual tripwire gets set off, and we lose that system of Jesus, and we try to resort back to our old ways. But the good news is the new system is always there. All we got to do is get that spiritual wrench and turn it back on, and we are in business. If Jesus never leaves us, those new pipes are always there for us to go back to. They are always there. And best news of all, that new piping doesn't cost us anything. It did at our house. It cost a lot. But with Jesus, it is free. It is a free gift that we receive. As Paul says, it is a gift that has been bestowed upon us. That Spirit is given to us through Jesus, and it is always there. We can always go back to it. We start to think we are slipping back into those old Ian ways. The system is always there for a reset. And that's what our church family is for, right? That's why we come to worship on Sundays, right? To get a little bit of a spiritual reset. That's why we are a part of a faith community, so we can all kind of help each other with our maintenance of our piping system, right? Our spiritual pipe system. Yes, we help each other to continue to let that clean Jesus burning gas course through us, bringing light and warmth, not only to ourselves, but to others, especially those who are in need in this world, those who need the light of Christ. Now, I know this can feel maybe a little overwhelming or intimidating, this idea that, you mean like I'm always supposed to be salt and light? Like I can never stop? Like Jesus says our righteousness is supposed to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees? Like what? How is that possible? I can't be a perfect Christian. Is anybody else feeling like, oh, I can't be a perfect Christian. I'm a little worried about this morning. Okay, it's okay. I think that's why Jesus used the analogies he used of salt and light. Okay, Jesus is not asking us to be like the big light in Las Vegas. I think it's like the biggest in the world. The Luxor beam? Yeah. Jesus is not saying we have to be this humongous light, right? He's not saying we have to be salt flats that, stretch for miles and miles. Jesus is just asking us to be a little grain of salt, that adds a bit of flavor. Jesus is asking us to shine the little flame that we have in us. And it's when we join together with all of our grains, with all of our flames, that's when the power of the Spirit shines forth and can flavor the whole world. We're called to do it together. We're here for each other. It's like this book that a local pastor wrote, Reverend Carl Vaders. It's called Think Like a Grasshopper. And it's about how when he first started being a pastor, he pretty much burned himself out, like had a nervous breakdown, because he was trying so hard to grow his little church into a mega church, because that's what Jesus wanted. That's what he thought Jesus wanted, right? And he came across this verse in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33. And it's when the people of Israel were going into the promised land for the first time. They sent spies. The spies came back and said, "Whoa, Nelly." Like the spy said, "We saw all the nations that are out there, all the peoples, and they are like giants compared to us. We are like grasshoppers." The people of Israel thought, there's no way we can do this. We're not big enough. We're not powerful enough. But who did they have on their side? God. And they were able to go into the promised land and make a new beginning and work toward being the light for all the nations that God had called them to be. And out of that came Jesus for the whole world. So yes, we may feel like grasshoppers. Yes, we may feel like we are just a little grain of salt. We are just one little flame. But in God's hands, we can accomplish so much good for this world if we're just not afraid to try. If we join hands and try together. And so, my friends, I want you to remember, about the righteousness and exceeding it. We're going to talk about that next week, so stay tuned. We're going to really get into the Greek about what Jesus is saying about exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. But for now, I just want you to remember today that your little grain, your little flame is all that God needs. Trust that new pipe system that Jesus has put in you. You are capable of doing whatever God is calling you to do. So let us join together. Let us leave that Eonism, and for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of the world that Jesus loved so much, let us go out and be his Christians.